Hi everyone, this week's lecture is on perception and decision making. People in organizations must make many decisions, from deciding to join an organization, to whom we can trust in the organization, which target customer to pursue, where to invest, and what courses of action to take each day. Now, the quality of these decisions depends on the quality of the input, that is, the information that we gather from our perception. In theory, accurate perception and unbiased decision-making process should lead to sound, practical decision that yield good outcomes for the organization. But we all know that human perception and the decision-making process has a limitation. Let's look at these potential problems and how we can improve individuals' decision-making in organization. Let's start by understanding perception in organization. Perception is a process by which individuals organize and interpret their sensory impressions to give meaning to their environment. At work, we'll receive a lot of sensory input from our boss, our coworker, our customer. We need to interpret these inputs and make sense of the environment and the situation that we are in. For example, have you ever found someone very annoying but others think he or she is super nice, right? You might find a company unfair and taking advantage of its employee while others think it's a great place to work. So why do people have totally different perceptions of the same person or the same organization? We often assume that our eyes and ears are like camera, like recording the objective reality, but what we perceive can be substantially different from the objective reality, because three main category of factors that shapes and sometimes distort how we see the world. First is the factors within the perceiver, right? The factors that lives within you. When you look at a target person or organization, your interpretation of that person behaviors is heavily influenced by your own personal characteristic. You don't see things as they are, but you see them as you are, right? Because you are influenced by your own attitude, motive, interest, past experience, and expectation. For example, generally, research shows that most bosses perceive employees who start work early, who come to work early, as more conscientious, more effective. However, supervisor who are night hours, let's say you are night hours, you usually stay up late, you prefer to work at night and you don't want to wake up early, right? If you yourself as a supervisor is a night hour, they are less likely to make assumption that people who come to work early is more conscientious or effective, because they know they have their own experience, right, and their own characteristic. As the night hours, they understand people who are of the same kind, right? So they perceive these people different from what other people generally see. The second category involves the characteristic of the person or object that are being observed. We don't look at the target person or organization or objects in isolation. We perceive them in relation to their backgrounds and our tendency to group similar things together, right? And so key influence factors and influence the way we perceive the target object or person is their novelty, motion, sound, size, background, proximity, or similarity, right? These things groups together, these are related to that object, so it might be similar, things like that. So think about crowdfunding, right? So the investor are significantly more likely to fund entrepreneur that they perceive as passionate, like showing like they really like they have a burning desire to build this business so that they can solve something, some problems, right? So the target visible enthusiasm, right? So if they make it really visible, show it on the stage, it's a characteristic of that person that are presenting, right? It could sway the perceiver's judgment of whether a business is a good investment, right? So people might the investor might look at like how passionate the entrepreneur seems to be, instead of analyzing whether or not the business is based on like valid information and analysis, right? And the last group of factor is the context, right? The situation, the where and when, that can completely change your interpretation of the exact same target, right? So depending on like how you perceive something, maybe it depends on timing, like the work setting or the social setting. Imagine meeting a potential client. So if your office is messy, the client may perceive you as anxious or lacking conscientiousness. The exact same person with the exact same skills might be perceived as a pro if you met them or him or her in a neat, organized setting. So the location, the situation, the background information could distort the perception of that person that you are looking at. Now, why is perception relevant in the decision-making process? The decision-making process usually begins with a problem, right? You have a problem, which is a discrepancy between the current state of affairs and some desired state, and you want to achieve that desired state. However, whether or not a problem even exists is a matter of perception. For example, so one manager might see a 2% drop in sale as a temporary fluctuation, whereas another manager might see it as catastrophic crisis that require immediate layoff, right, to save costs, right? But the objective reality is the same, right? It's a 2% drop in sales, but the perceived reality, that's what matters. That's what determines the response that you will have. So if the perception is too deviated from reality, you input inaccurate information into the decision-making process. You may arrive at a poor decision. In other words, the decision is as good as the perception that informed it. So let's focus on the mechanism of perceiving other people and their behaviors in the organization, and what can go wrong with our perception. First, the attribution theory proposed that to form a perception or conclusion about a person, we systematically observe and record their behavior, just as scientists collect data to test their hypothesis. And from this observed data, we will make an interpretation, and there's three dimensions that we will look at: the distinctiveness, consensus, and consistency. Right? Distinctiveness is whether or not this person is doing the same behavior in other setting with other people. Consensus is whether or not other people will do the same thing as this person that we observe. And consistency is this person consistently doing this behavior over and over again, right? And that will lead us to the attribution of the causes, whether it's their personality, their internal characteristic, or is it something that is outside of themselves. It's something like in the environment, in the situation. Let's look at an example. Let's say you have an employee named John, and you observe that he has an argument with Terry, which will be a target person in this case. So distinctiveness question is whether John also have an argument with other people or just Terry. Consensus question is, did other employees also have an argument with the target person, which is Terry? And consistency is the question whether John consistently argue with Terry, right? So if John has an argument with everyone, this is low distinctiveness. So he argue with everyone, not just Terry, so low distinctiveness. Other employees rarely have an argument with the target person or Terry, so this is the low consensus. And John always has an argument with the target person or Terry, so this is high consistency. We will conclude that John himself is the problem. He's the troublemaker. He argues with anyone. If John rarely has an argument with anyone else, this is high distinctiveness. Right? He only argue with Terry, but not other people. He has an argument with Terry every time they met. This is high consistency. And other people also have an argument with Terry. So this is high consensus. We will conclude that the target person is the annoying, nasty person. That is, Terry is the trouble, right? On the other hand, if John rarely has an argument with anyone, this is high distinctiveness. Other employees rarely have an argument with the target person, low consensus. And John and Terry rarely have any argument before. This is low consistency. Then it must be something specific to the current situation. It must be something external to the characteristic of John and Terry. Yeah, so it might be that they are in a situation where they have misunderstanding or they disagree on some issue. Okay, I'd like to note that when we talk about attribution theory, it's kind of assumed that human beings are rational, right? We pay attention to the information, we spend time, we have the motivation to look at the data, analyze the data to arrive at accurate decision. But in fact, we human often make attribution errors. Our brain usually short circuit, right? We take shortcut when we judge other people. And these errors can impact hiring, performance reviews, and daily teamwork. So let's look at common errors and bias in person perception, and let's see how we can prevent them. First, the fundamental attribution error. When we make judgment of other people, we have a tendency to underestimate the influence of external factors like bad economy or heavy traffic, and overestimate the influence of internal personal factors like incompetence or laziness or intelligence, right? For example, we often perceive wealthy individuals, those who are successful businessmen or women, we think they are smart, savvy, effective, productive, but completely ignoring the external advantages they might have. For example, they might be born, because they were born into a wealthy family, they already have a lot of money to begin with. They have a lot of opportunity and connections that contribute to that success. But the second error or bias that we usually do in person perception is when we perceive ourselves, right? Self-serving bias. So interestingly, we use different set of rules for ourselves when we try to understand or perceive or describe ourselves. We usually attribute our own success to internal factors like hard work, but we blame our failure on external factors like bad luck or the system, right? If you for example, if you close a big deal, right, you might say it was because of your great sales skills. If you lose it, you will blame the company's high price, or this is a difficult client which I cannot make them happy with the deal, like no matter what I propose, right? Next, selective perception. This is because we have limitation in how much information we can take in at a time, right? We cannot process every single stimulus, every pieces of information that we encounter at the same time. So we have to select what to notice, what to pay attention to based on our own interest, background, and attitude. For example, a manager who focuses strictly on the bottom line, right, the profit and loss, they might notice every financial fluctuation, but completely filter out data that shows that their employees' job satisfaction is declining. A lot of them are now burning out because that's not what they are interested in. Next, halo and horns effect. So halo effect occurs when we let one positive trait, like sociability or appearance, to cloud our general impression of someone. And horn effect is the opposite. So one negative trait leads us to assume that that person is bad in something that is unrelated to that characteristic. For example, a recruiter meet a very friendly applicant, right? And they might immediately assume that this applicant is also highly intelligent, highly skilled, even though these traits, right, intelligence and skillfulness, are not related to being friendly, right? Contrast effect, right? Next, we don't evaluate people in vacuum. We will compare them to other people that we just met. If the person before you was exceptional, you will look worse, like by comparison to that person, right? For example, if you go to a job interview, right? If the first candidate before you is the superstar, really great at their job, the background is so perfect, right? The next average candidate may be rated much lower than they normally would be because of the contrast effect. When they look at the first candidate and then the second candidate, even he or she is not that bad, is an average candidate, but they might get like exceptionally low score because of the contrast effect. Next, stereotyping. So this is the ultimate shortcut. Like it's allow you to make judgment of someone based on the perception of the group that person belong to, right? So you don't have to pay attention to any individual information. You just know that this person come from this social group, they come from this country, they come from this socio-economic background, and then you just assume that they have some kind of characteristic that is related to the group, right? So this is stereotypes actually help us simplifying the world for us, but sometimes it's is inaccurate and it's not fair to judge someone based only on their social group, right? For example, when you have nurses that are male, right? Sometimes because we usually have the stereotype that nurse must be female because they take care of people, but in fact we also have male nurses, but these groups often face negative stereotyping because others assume that they lack empathy or compassion because they usually they generalize the generalization that nursing is a female profession, right? It's suitable for female, not male. So male in this profession will be judged negatively. Why does the understanding of these bias perception matters for your future career as a manager or employees? It matters because perception isn't just an internal thought process that stays in someone's mind. It translated into actions that affect people's career or their chance of success. Let's look at the three most critical contexts in organizations where bias can lead to a poor decision making that affects people. At the employment interview, the interview is often the primary gatekeeper for entering the organization. However, research shows that interviewers generally make perceptual judgments that are often inaccurate. Most interviewers form an opinion of a candidate within the first tenth of a second of meeting them. So if the initial impression is negative, they will spend the rest of the time looking for evidence to support that initial perception. And this is the evidence of Horn's effects that we talked about earlier, right? So instead of trying to objectively evaluate your skill, your other characteristic, they spend time looking for evidence that support their initial perception, negative perception. And Yeah, it's the evidence of evidence of selective perception, and you can also see contrast effect in the interview, right? People who are highly qualified, like the candidate who are highly qualified, might be rejected simply because they follow a superstar, right, in the interview. Like the person who was interviewed before them was superstar, really smart, and even though the next person is also highly qualified, but because of the contrast effect, they got rated like negatively, because it's the comparison that the interviewer might make with the previous candidate, or because maybe they might be evaluated negatively because that they of some from some stereotype group, right? The company might hire people who are less competent but look good on the interview or fit with the short stereotype, because they don't focus on the true like information. They just focus on the look of that person, whether or not they fit with the stereotype for that career. Next area in the organizations that we should be especially aware of possible bias perception is performance expectation. Okay, in psychology, I think you've learned about the term Pygmalion effect or self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It's the phenomenon where individual behavior is determined by the expectation of other people. Like if a manager perceives an employee as high potential, that manager will provide more training, more feedback, and more opportunity, and that set of behavior is actually what make that employee a successful employee, right? But that behaviors came out of the expectation that this person is a smart and high potential employees, right? We can also observe confirmation bias in the performance expectation area. So the employee perceive the manager confidence and work harder, confirming the manager's initial perception. Conversely, if a manager perceives someone as lazy, if a manager perceive you as someone as lazy, they withhold support, they don't help, right? So the employee become demotivated and then perform poorly, and then manager say, yeah, see, I know that they were lazy, right? And so the perception actually, the manager perception is actually what create the reality, because that expectation, that perception caused them to do something, to take some action that actually make that expectation come true. Next, in the area of performance evaluation. Performance evaluation are meant to be objective, but they are deeply impacted by the perceiver's shortcut, right? Even though many jobs have hard data like sales number, rating from customer, right? But many components are subjective, like teamwork or leadership skills. These subjective measures are breeding grounds for error, right? People, because it allows people to use subjective judgment, right? And that a chance of biases or errors to come in. For example, a manager might give an employee a low rating because of one mistake that happened last week, so they have a viability bias, right? Something just happened recently, it's easy to come to your mind when you give a rating, and ignore the other 10 months of excellent work that they have done. Or they might give a friendly employee high rating across the board, even if their technical work is subpar, like they are not very good at doing the job, but they happen to be more friendly, and this is halo effect, right? So because they are friendly, they have one positive characteristic, it leads to a biased judgment. So this leads to unfair pay, missed promotion, and high turnover rate once people feels that the judgment or the perception of the manager is not fair. So to conclude this section, right? In the future, I'm pretty sure that you will move into management level, right? You cannot eliminate bias, right? When you evaluate your employees, right? But you can manage it, right? But you have to start by acknowledge, recognize that you have your first impression, which might be a shortcut, and that might not be the fact, right? So you must be ready to take into account like other information, right? Don't rely too much on your first impression because you might be wrong. Next, you must standardize, right? Standardize the method, the way you ask questions for the interview, the evaluation form, evaluation metrics for performance evaluation. It must be standardized. It must be communicate so that everyone who is in the role of evaluating other people, other employees, understand exactly what it means to have this level of performance. It must be standardized across the board in the organization. And you have to audit yourself, right? After you make decision, after you make judgment of others, ask yourself, would I be judging this behavior the same way if it were a different employees, right? To reflect on your judgment or perception, and monitor like what you have done, what you have decided, and see if there is any error, and try to be aware of it so that you can avoid it next time. Now let's look at decision-making process, right? What could go wrong in the process when you try to make a decision in an organization? According to a survey by McKinsey & Company in 2019, managers spend roughly a third of their time making decisions. So do managers who make more decisions become better at it? Well, not necessarily. Whether those who spend up to 30% of their time making decisions, or those who spend at least 31% of their time, that means they make a lot of decisions, right? But in both cases, only a tiny fraction of them rate their decision as highly effective. Let's look at a case study on Virgin Cola, an ambitious project by Richard Branson, a famous British serial entrepreneur. He started so many diverse businesses under the brand Virgin. Many of his businesses are successful, like Virgin Record, Virgin Airline, but some fail miserably to the point that we, like in hindsight, would scratch our head and ask like what he was thinking when he decided to start that business. For example, Virgin Cola. In 1994, Sir Richard Branson decided to take on the giants of the soft drink world, the Coca-Cola and Pepsi. This wasn't a decision born from months of cold hard data analysis, but rather from Branson's intuition, right? It's his trademark characteristic, I would say. And intuition is defined as an unconscious process created from distilled experience. So after long years of experience, you learn so many things, but it informs you intuitively, right? You don't have to rely on data, but based on your gut feeling, you think this is right. So Branson has long admitted to making major business moves based on creative instinct or gut feeling. For Virgin Cola, his intuition suggests that Virgin brand was strong enough to disrupt a massive new market in the cola drinks, right? So while Branson's is visionary, um, the Virgin Cola case is often cited as the prime example of bounded rationality. So the term bounded rationality is when we cannot capture the full complexity of the problem. We don't see the big picture. We cannot process all the information because there's so much information. So we operate within a simplified model, right? We pick and choose, perceive only essential features of the situation. We focus on just some part of the information of the model. In this case, Branson may have oversimplified the challenge and focusing on the strength of his brand, that Virgin is a strong brand, and underestimate the power of and the distribution network of his giant rivals, that is Coca-Cola and Pepsi, right? Some critics argue that Virgin Cola launch suffer from a lack of deep market research, so he lacked the proper rational analysis, right? So lack of deep market research and misinterpretation of consumer behavior. And by April 2001, Virgin Drinks USA closed with only 0.5% market share. So tiny, right? By 2012, the production ceased entirely, so they stopped producing Virgin Cola altogether. And the decision-making process, why it's bold, it's interesting, right? Fascinating, but it failed, right? It cannot account for the intractable complexity of the global soft drink industry, right? He underestimate the complexity of this market. So from this case study, was Branson wrong to trust his gut? Maybe not, right? It's while Virgin Cola was a failure, Branson's willingness to take risk and follow his instinct is exactly what made him successful in many business, right? The lesson could be, if we want to take lesson from this, I think we can say that intuition is a powerful tool for generating ideas and hypotheses, but it's not a proof that the idea will be successful. So you might use intuition to make fast and quick idea generation, right? So you generate interesting idea based on intuition, but it can lead to the leader or the decision maker to be blind to some information, right? So it will be better if you start with intuition, your gut feeling, and then take rational analysis, like complement it with rational analysis, and it will help reduce the chance of failure. So from the Virgin Cola case, we talk about different style of decision making. Let's look at the formal definition of each here again. So the rational decision-making model is the decision-making model that describes how individuals should behave to maximize some outcome. So this model believes that people are rational. They will consider all the information and make best decision that maximize the benefit for everyone. Next, bounded rationality, right? Even though we want to believe that people are rational and carefully analyze all the data, we are not like that all the time, right? So bounded rationality is a simplified process of making decisions by perceiving and interpreting essential features of problems without capturing their complexity. So we cannot, so it's a limitation, human limitation of we cannot pay attention to all the details, especially when the situation is complex. We rely on some kind of simplified model, and we might miss something with the bounded rationality. And then we have intuition. Sometimes we make decisions using intuition, which is an unconscious process that were born out of distilled experience. You have a long years of experience, and yeah, you don't know what could come from, but your gut feelings tells you. That's intuition. So for the rational decision making model, there will be 6 steps, right? When you approach a problems, you start by defining the problem, so clearly state the issues to be addressed, what's wrong, what is the issues that I need to solve, and then you identify decision criteria, like determine the factors to consider. So what are the do I have to think about people? Do I have to think about money? What are the criteria that I have to take into account? And then you allocate the weights to the criteria. So if there are like 3 things that I have to make sure that we consider, which one are the most important? You're focusing on bottom line, for example. You also have to think about your stakeholders' satisfaction, but which one has stronger weight on your decision? You have to care more about one factor over the others. And then you develop alternative, right? Create different scenario, different solutions, right? There are a lot of possible solutions, and then you evaluate each alternative, like which one will give you the maximum utility, right? According to the criteria that you set for this decision. After you evaluate the alternative, then you select the best alternative that provide the best outcome according to the criteria you set for this decision making. So rational decision making model has a merits, right? It's good method because it encourages high efficiency, productivity, and logic, right? You rely on systematic data analysis, right? Logic and every logical analysis. You use objective data and dispassionate analysis, meaning that you don't allow your subjective biases to sway the result. And it's best for finding optimal solution when all information is available. So if you have all the necessary or relevant information and you can find a way to analyze it, rational decision making model should give you the best result or the best outcome for you. But there are some weaknesses for this model. So even though we want to believe that it's the best way to arrive at the solution, we kind of assume that that's the case, right? We assume that this process is a complete, unbiased information, which is rarely possible. A lot of time we start with some biased information, right? And with biased information or error, the outcome could not be like perfect, like perfectly rational. It can lead to intractable problems where the situation changed before the analysis is done. So if you said, it's gonna take me 3 months to analyze whether or not we should enter this new market, and then customer behavior change, right? That market is not there anymore, right? That's possible. And it's costly in terms of time, energy, and money, of course. You have to spend a long time, energy, and money in order to collect data and analyze, right? So that's the weaknesses. Next, the bounded rationality, right? Well, when the world is complex, sometimes we cannot consider like everything, right? So the merits of bounded rationality is that it's more sensible for complex problems that cannot fit into the rational model, because it's impossible for you to take everything into account, right? It reduces complex issue to a level that is it's easily understood, right? Easier to understand, and it saves time and resources by finding a good enough solution, or we call it satisfying, right? It's good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect. There can be some error, but I think with this 80% chance of success or accuracy, I'm happy with that. But the weaknesses of bounded rationality is that it leads to suboptimal decision, because awareness and resources are limited, right? And it prone to systematic and predictable errors in judgment, right? People, there are so many types of biases and errors, which we will talk about later. So yeah, with bounded rationality, because we don't spend all the time like analyzing it systematically, we can be prone to some biases. And another weak point is usually we might focus on symptoms rather than the root causes, right? Because the symptom is something that is salient, easy to pick up, easy to see, compared to the root causes. So maybe we just focus on the symptom rather than trying to dig deep into root cause, in which in many cases we might not see it, like it might not be obvious, right? And intuition, right? The strength of intuition is it's extremely fast, right? Based on your gut feeling. So you wake up one day and you feel like this is the right decision, this is the right direction that we should take, right? So yeah, it relies on holistic association. Based on 10 years of experience that I have, I feel that this is right, right? It's essential in crisis and high risky, uncertain contexts where quick action is needed, right? Okay, you cannot spend 2 months or 3 months analyzing the data. You have to decide now. You have to rely on your gut feeling and your intuition, because there's no way you can gather any data right now. So people who can use intuition must have a lot of experience that they can distill so that it informs their feeling, their gut feeling. Generally, it is useful for setting up initial hypothesis, right? So in this case, anyone can have gut feeling and intuition based on their experience. So that can be the starting point where you start doing something, and then use rational method. You collect data to verify that later. Yeah, so intuition is a good way to start to generate new ideas, right? But the weaknesses, I think you can figure that, right? It's highly emotionally charged, right? Because it's based on your feeling, right? And that can be a biased judgment, right? It's hard to measure or analyze logically because it's feeling, and it can cause people or the manager to ignore contradictory information, right? Because when you have intuition, you kind of like, oh, I will follow my heart, I will follow my instinct, right? So you don't rely on facts, but yeah, rely on something that cannot be measured. And here are the common biases and errors in decision making that can happen because you have bounded rationality, right? You cannot. It's impossible for you to pay attention to everything all the time, so you are prone to these biases, right? Let's look at some of them. First, the overconfidence bias. Right? This is our tendency to be too confident in our own ability or other people's ability, like our leader or our teammates, right? Without realizing it, right? We are too confident in our ability or our leader's ability, and we don't know that we are too optimistic, right? So people with weakest intellectual interpersonal skills are actually the most likely to overestimate themselves. Yeah, I think this is called the Dunning and Kruger effect, right? People who know a little bit about something tend to have higher confidence than those who know a lot about that field, because people who have very few knowledge about the field, they don't know like what is the boundaries of the field. Like they don't know like how vast or how much the information or things that they need to know out there in the field. So they only know maybe 5% of it, and they think that's all that they should know, so they become too confident. For example, like a hiring manager, they might feel like 100% certain that they have found the perfect candidate after a single informal chat, so they ignore objective data that suggests the candidate might not be a fit, right? Because they are too confident in their judgment. Next, confirmation bias. So we are not as subjective, we are not as objective as we think we are. Confirmation bias is a form of selective perception where we actively seek out information that supports our current views, our current expectation, and ignore or being skeptical of anything that challenge our perception or our belief, right? For example, if a boss thinks that you are unreliable, they will remember one time that you were 5 minutes late, but completely overlook the 3 weeks you stay late to finish your project, right? Because that's not confirming what they believe about you, but that just one time that you were late, that confirmed their belief about you, so they remember that vividly. Next, the sunk cost effect, or you can also call it the escalation of commitment, right? The sunk cost effect is when we stay with a failing decision, even when there is clear evidence that it's wrong. Like you invest in some business and you keep losing the money, but you keep doubling down on like, oh, I'm gonna like reinvest in that, because you feel like responsible, right, for the outcome. We fear of being called a failure, right? We don't give up on something that we already see that it's failing. For example, an entrepreneur might keep pouring money into a business that is clearly like failing. They keep losing money every month, every year, because they have already invested a lot in that business, right? Their time, their resources, their money, and also their ego, their identity into that. So they cannot stop, because that means they're gonna like lose everything. They will feel like, they don't want to feel like a failure. They keep like maintaining that business even though it's like hurting them. Next, risk aversion. So it's a tendency to prefer a sure thing over a risky outcome, even though the risky outcome has a higher potential payoff, right? So yeah, it sounds like playing it safe, right? But it can lead to the stagnation in organizations. So people don't want to risk doing anything new. They don't want to change anything because they think staying with the same solution, using the same method is safer, and they fear of the unknown, right? So managers who are risk averse often stick to like established method, what they have done in the past, rather than innovating, because they fear the personal or professional cost of a failure. What if I try new thing and I fail, right? People don't want to be a failure. Yeah, so let's use an example of an executive who refused to invest in a new high potential technology because there is a small chance that it might fail. So instead, they keep funding an old declining product line because it feels safe, because it's used to be successful before, right? Even though they are losing market share in the long run if they don't innovate or come up with new products. Next, the outcome bias, right? Outcome bias is closely related to hindsight bias, which we will talk about soon. So outcome bias is the tendency to judge a decision based on its final result rather than the quality of the process that we used to make that decision in the first place, right? So if the outcome was good, we assume that we make good decision. The decision was smart, right? If the outcome was bad, we assume that the decision was stupid, right? You make a bad judgment. This is a mistake because we forget about luck, right? A lucky person can make a terrible decision, but luckily it happened to work out, right? Even though it's a bad decision. Whereas smart person can make a very great decision, like a very careful decision, but they fail because of some random chance or bad lucks, right? So an example would be like a manager who decides to launch a product without any market research, right? But because of luck, it becomes a viral. Because of the outcome bias, the company might think, hey, this manager is so smart because he's successful in launching this product, even though when he launched the product, he didn't do any like careful calculation or any analysis. Like, it's just lucky. He's just lucky. But the company think he's so visionary, right, and promote this manager even though that decision-making process is flawed, is too risky, right? Yeah, we still got more. So we have a lot of biases and error. We have anchoring bias, right? This happens when your mind fixate on the first piece of information that you receive, and you fail to adjust when new information comes in, right? The first number of the fact that you get is the anchor, right? It anchors your perspective. For example, in a salary negotiation, well, if you shoot the starting point, like the first number that we mentioned, even if it's low, it's usually set the range for the entire discussion. But if you start high, the chance is that you will end up like getting higher salary than when you start lower, right? Because people tend to anchor like their decision around that first number. Next, the availability bias. So this is the tendency to base judgment on information that is available or easy to recall. So something that is recent or highly emotional, like I think you've learned this in social psych, right? So a news report on a plane crash, it stays fresh in your mind because it's so scary, it's so emotional, and the media keep repeating that, right? It leads us to overestimate of how likely those events actually are in organization setting. For example, a manager might give an employee a poor performance review because they made a mistake last week, just recently, even if the employee was a star performer for the previous 10 months, right? They have been good all along, right? But because last week, he made a memorable mistake, okay? Next, the randomness error. So we like to believe we have control over the world. So even if a lot of events are actually random, but we try to create meaning out of random events because we think we can control it, right? We turn this imaginary pattern into rules. We create superstitions that can impair our decision making. For example, a manager might refuse to sign important contract on Friday the 13th. Yeah, so like in Thailand we call it a mu telu things, no? Um, so because it's a bad luck, and we can avoid bad luck if you don't sign a contract on Friday the 13th, right? Um, yeah, yeah. But success is sometimes has an element of luck. Sometimes it's a random thing, but you try to create a sense of control by avoiding something kind of superstitious belief that make you feel like you are in control of those chances event. And the last one, the hindsight bias, right? Sometimes you look at some events, right, some disaster, and thought, I knew that was going to happen. I knew that this person is gonna do this, right? But you said that after the fact that you learn about the event, you know what happened, what had happened, and this is called the hindsight bias, right? So if you were asked to make a prediction early on before the events unfold, you might not be able to predict it. But once you learn about what actually happened, you have a sense of like, oh, I know it all along. I know this before it happened, right? This is dangerous because it makes us overconfident in our predictive ability in the future, right? It stops us from actually learning why mistakes occur. So, for example, after a company stock price crashes, an investor might claim that the sign was obvious all along, right? But in reality, before the crash, right, before the stock price crash, those same investor will think that, oh, I'm not sure, I don't know what would happen, right? So before the events, people cannot make accurate prediction, but they think they could after they have learned what actually happened. That's hindsight bias. Okay, we look at the ideal ways to make decision like rational model, but in real world, no one make decision um, in vacuum. Like there are other information, other factors that can make us bias or make errors, right? Even though you try to be rational, you are limited to who you are and where you work for. So we call these factors like individual differences and organizational constraints that limit your ability to be perfectly rational. For individual differences factors, right? Even in the same situation, two different people will make different choices based on their personal makeup, personal characteristic, right? For example, highly conscientious people are more likely to escalate commitment, so stick to the failing plan or the sunk cost effect because they hate to fail and they feel responsible for the outcome, right? So those who are conscientious are more prone to sunk cost effect. And achievement striving, people who have high achievement need, right? They strive for high achievement. They're susceptible to hindsight bias because they have a strong need to justify their action. Yes, I am a successful person. I'm good at this. I can predict it all along, right? Even though it's just an illusion that you know it before the event happened. Self-esteem, right? People with high self-esteem often use self-serving bias to maintain their positive self-image and blaming others for failure, right? So you tend to have these bias more than others. Gender, um, well, research shows that men and women are largely similar in decision quality, right? But difference appears under stress, right? Men often become more egocentric and take riskier gamble, while women tend to become more empathetic and their decision-making style are more balanced, right? So men are kind of maybe riskier, making making them like more prone to some error and biases than women, according to research. Mental ability, right? Generally, smart people are better at processing information and learning quickly, but being smart does not guarantee that you are immune to errors, right? In fact, highly intelligent people can be even more susceptible to overconfidence and anchoring because they trust their own logic and their own ability too much. And the second groups of constraints, organizational constraints, right? Organization can create systems that limits a manager's freedom of choice, right? Even though they want to make rational decision, but the rule might not allow them to, right? For example, in an performance evaluation system, managers are strongly influenced by the criteria on which they are evaluated. If manager believes that their boss hates negative news, they will filter out the data to ensure that their decision always looks successful on the paper, right? So they are not like presenting the truth, so to speak. Okay. Reward system. The organization's reward system signal which choices are preferable. If the company reward risk aversion, you won't see many innovation decision, right? And even if they are the most rational choice for long-term growth, right? In a company where you have to compete with so many competitors, you need to create innovations, but the reward system like still like give more reward to people who stick to the rules, and give punishment to people who try new things and fail, right? Which is a part of innovation. It's a part of like creating innovation, right? Try new things and fail. But if you don't reward that behavior and you punish them and you reward people who stick to the rule, who don't make any mistake, then you're not gonna there's no chance that you will develop new innovations, right? And sometimes it's the formal regulations, right? Every organization has rule, policy, procedure that with the aim to standardize behavior so that everyone perform like the same way. But these limits, right? It reduces the number of alternatives that a decision maker can even consider. For example, at Taco Bell's, right? I think it's in the textbook. You can read about it's an opinion from employees from Taco Bell, and he said that there are like rules and regulation for almost anything, so he cannot do anything else. So he just need to follow the rules. So it's impossible for him to try to use his own judgment. Okay, and time limit, right? When you're in under time constraint, you have deadlines. This pressure often forces manager to use bounded rationality and satisficing, because you don't have enough time to process everything. So you rely on heuristic, something that will help you make a quick decision. Rather than gathering all the necessary data for an optimal choices, right? Okay, up to this point, we've talked about how we do make decision, right? Using intuition, bounded rationality, or falling prey to biases. But now we shift from the how to the should, like what we should do, how we should make decision. So we are talking about ethics. So in business context, it is tempting to think that a good decision is something that is rational and profitable, like make more money, right? However, history is there are so many things, so many stories in the history that shows that companies that made rational choice to maximize profit, but forget about ethics, end up in total ruins, right? Because they ignore ethical dimension. For example, like company like Enron, and Volkswagen's. Well, Volkswagen has the case called the diesel gate, where they fake the number of the the performance of the engine in reducing greenhouse emission gas, right? So yeah, they fake that report, they fake that number, they sell the cars very successful, but then people find out later, so that ruins their trust, the trust that people have in the brand Volkswagen. Yeah, a lot of lawsuits, things like that, right? So that's why we must consciously consider whether our decisions are ethical, right? So how do we actually do this? So how do we evaluate whether our decision is ethical? We don't just guess what is ethical. Right? There are three specific frameworks to evaluate our choice: utilitarianism, rights, and justice. So let's break down how to apply these to real world business problems. When we face with an ethical dilemma, so we can't just rely on our feeling what is right or wrong. We need a systematic way to evaluate our options, like whether this one is ethical or not. In organizational behavior, we look at three primary criteria: right? Utilitarian, rights, and justice. Each of these perspectives provide a different lens through which we view a good decision, right? Which decision is good or bad. For the utilitarianism or the outcome lens, so this is a system where decisions are made solely on the basis of their outcomes or consequences. So the goal is to provide the greatest good for the greatest number. So this is the dominant method used by business decision makers because it's aligned with goals like efficiency, productivity, and profit, right? The good side of strength is it promotes efficiencies and can be justified by hard data and bottom line result, right? You can measure, it's easy to measure whether or not you make profit, right? Did your decision lead to higher productivity, things like that? But the downside is that it can downplay the importance of individuals' right, especially those in the minority or people or other stakeholders, your employees, right? Because you focus more on the bottom line, on the profits, you might forget about people, for example. Let's look at an example. For example, a company might decide to lay off 10% of its worker to keep the remaining 90% employed and make the company profitable, right? You cut the cost of human resources and force the rest of the employees to work harder and make more profit, right? From utilitarian view, this is an ethical decision because it's protect the majority. Like 90% still has jobs and it create a lot of benefit, right? But is it the right thing to do if you look at it through another lens called the liberties lens or the rights? Right? The second criterion focus on rights, and this means making decision consistent with the fundamental liberties and privilege, and respect people's right. In an organization, this protects whistleblowers who report unethical practices and protects the privacy and free speech of employees, right? So the good side of it is it protects individuals from tyranny of the majority, ensure basic human dignity, right? You still have to respect people even though they are minority, right? But the downside is that it can create a legalistic environment that hinder productivity and efficiency. So everything has to be like checked for like, is it legal, right? For example, an employer may want to monitor an employee's private social media to see if they are bad-mouthing the company, right? Saying bad thing about the company. Well, from the rights approach, we would argue that this is unethical because it violate individuals' right to privacy. Even if knowing that info might help the company's productivity, right? Even though it help with the it's good in from the lens of utilitarianism, but it's bad from the lens through the lens of individuals' right. And finally, we have the third criterion called justice. Right? It requires individuals to impose and enforce rules fairly and impartially, so there is an equitable distribution of benefits and costs. So it's about following moral norms and ensure that the process is fair for everyone, regardless of the outcome. The good side is it protects the interests of the underrepresented and less powerful member of the organization. But the downside is it can encourage a sense of entitlement and reduce risk-taking or innovation, right? Because even though I'm a minority, I should get paid equal to other people. Even though I'm a little bit slack off, I still get paid equal to other people. That's not good either, right? So yeah, a manager, for example, a manager decides to give every employee a 3% raise regardless of individual performance because the cost of living went up for everyone. So he focused on the justice of equitable distribution rather than rewarding the top performer, right? So this is like equity. On the previous slide, we looked at the three traditional pillars of ethical decision-making: utilitarianism, rights, and justice. But how do these academic theories actually show up in modern corporate strategy today, right? Leading organizations today use a framework called the triple bottom line, or the 3P: profit, people, and planet, which was developed by John Ecklington in 1994. Let's look at how these 3Ps act as the practical application of our ethical theories. The first P is profit, and this is utilitarianism, right? From a utilitarian perspective, a profitable company is ethical because it's providing greatest good by creating jobs, paying tax to the country so we can help the society, produce goods and services that the society wants. When a manager uses triple bottom line, they are not just looking at this year's cash flow, they are performing a calculus of utility. So to ensure that the company contribute to the long-term economic survival of the majority, their employees and the society. And then second, people and the right criterion. Right? The second P is people, and this linked directly to the right criterion. A company that commit to this pillar recognize that employees and community members have fundamental liberties that cannot be traded away for profit. It means protecting the right to privacy, safe working conditions, and fair wages, right? If a decision violates an individual rights, people's score would fail, right? Regardless of how high the profits are. So you cannot just ignore people and maximize your profit and don't care about people's lives and their safety or their right? The third P is planet, and the planet is connects to justice. Right? We can say that it's justice because justice is about the equitable distribution of benefit and burdens. So for decades, corporations took the benefit of production, but they offload the burden. Like they just release the greenhouse gases, pollution onto the planet, in the community that the people lives, right? So they pollute the earth, right? So the planet pillar demands that companies pay their fair share of environmental costs. So it's a justice in a way that the company should ensure that we we don't unfairly punish future generation by our consumption today, right? So you cannot make profit and then create a burden or cost to the next generation by polluting the environment. So I hope that as you enter the workforce, once you graduate, you work in a company. I hope you won't see ethics and the triple bottom line as a separate things, right? It has to go hand in hand. And by balancing these three, you ensure that your decisions are not just legally sound, but also ethically. It's also ethical for this century, right? The company make profit, you make people happy and protect their rights, and also protect the planet at the same time.